Muy bien. Sí. Vas.
So we're good to go whenever. And the podium mic is working.
Perfect.
Hi, John. How are you?
I have now opened my audio and I am fine.
Perfect. Nice to see you. So, welcome everybody to the presentation of El Pan Nuestro, una historia de la tortilla de maíz en México by Aurora Gómez. She will tell us how the book will be called in English. So we will hear from her in just a minute. Aurora Gómez is a professor of history in the School of Historical Studies at el Colegio de México. She's an expert of Mexican economic and social history. Her work focuses on understanding key issues of Mexican economic development and its impact on the well-being of the population. She received a BA in economics from ITAM and a PhD in history from Harvard University, and was the general director of the Mexican National Archives from 2009 to 2013. She has also held positions at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. She was a Tinker visiting professor at U Chicago. She was a professor at CIDE, el Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica in Mexico. She specializes in the history of industrialization and the evolution of business and the financial system, with a focus on workers' organization, living standards, and the participation of women in the labor force. Her previous book, Industry and Revolution, Economic and Social Changes in the Orizaba Valley, Mexico, published by Harvard University Press, studies these issues through the history of Mexico's textile industry. Her book is an approach, a similar approach to Mexican development and gender issues in Mexico through the lens of the tortilla industry. She has published extensively in the Journal of Economic History, Journal of Latin American Studies, Business History Review, many journals. So the book, it's amazing. Hopefully it will come out in English in a brief period of time. For those of you that speak Spanish, I guess it's available through Amazon, so you can get it through there. And it's a great story that touches on many elements of Mexican development, gender issues, the Mexican political economy under the PRI system, how technological progress affects economic development and how it generates displacement and significant social changes. So you can read it from many angles, and it's a great read. This event is co-sponsored by the Americas Forum and Professor John Tutino, and by the Georgetown Americas Institute. Most of you know or should know Professor John Tutino. He's a professor of history and international affairs at Georgetown and the director of the Americas Forum. His recent publications include The Mexican Heartland, How Communities Shape Capitalism, A Nation and World History, and The Bajío Revolution, Remaking Capitalism, Community and Patriarchy in Mexico, North America, and the World. So with that, thanks, Aurora, for coming, and the floor is yours.
I think it shows up. Sorry. Okay. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me here to,
everyone at Georgetown University, particularly Dr. Alejandro Werner and John Tutino. I am delighted to be here with you. And I will talk about this book I wrote about the history of tortillas and, women and tortillas in the making of Mexican history. First, I wanted to talk about why write about the history of tortillas. And it's not just any item or any food. It has a very particular importance. It has been the staple food for Mexicans since pre-Hispanic times, and not only for Mexicans, actually for all Mesoamericans. That includes many Central American countries. And through my research, I found out that this has really had an important impact in the history of Mexico and Central America, and even up to the present. There are many. There's a lot that has been written about corn, about maize, but actually we don't eat maize. We eat tortillas, and there's a huge difference between both of them, because it takes a lot of work to turn corn into tortillas, and that is particularly a work that has been undertaken by women since pre-Hispanic times. So by focusing on tortillas, it allows us to place in the center of the stage women, and that actually has made it clear for me that the way in which they have been invisible in the wide history, and how important they have been. Also, looking at Mexican history in the light of the tortillas allows us to observe several key issues that I think, that continue being important in the present. One of them is the difficult incorporation of women, particularly indigenous women, into the country's economy, political, and social life. Second, the difficulty of developing new technologies. As I will explain further, the fact that no other country faced the problem of grinding the substance from which tortillas are made it impossible to import this technology. And in a country like Mexico, where most technologies have been imported, it was difficult to have some innovation in this important issue, because it had to be developed internally. So this is also a very interesting case study that allows us to visualize the difficulty of producing technology and the importance of developing technology locally. Since this, I think, is an example of many other situations that developing countries face, in which their particular problems are not completely assessed by imported technologies. Then it also shows how oligopolistic industrial concentration has been prevalent in Mexico, and makes us wonder why it has been the case, and its relationship with government policy. So it also gives us very interesting cases of crony capitalism. Finally, it shows the difficulty in achieving a more equitable form of progress that values and incorporates our biological, ecological, and cultural wealth. So the first issue is that the fact that the diet of Mexico is based on nixtamalized maize is something that I think has a greater importance than has been given by research. It's a Mesoamerican peculiarity. It's also very intensive in terms of female labor, because no technological change was developed to carry out this chore of grinding the nixtamal until the late 19th century, and the diffusion of these technologies did not take place until the 20th century. So these, as I said, shaped the history of Mexico, particularly the history of women in Mexico, in a lasting way. The traditional process of making tortillas took between 5 and 6 hours of daily work, 365 days a year, because it cannot be stored. It was performed at a domestic level, and it took so much labor, and it was such a binding constraint for producing food that during the 19th century, it was considered by intellectuals as a constraint for population growth, and thus for the survival of Mexico as a nation. Particularly, these discussions came about in the years before the war with the United States. So my book talks about several issues, and I'm going to briefly address all of them. One of them, and well, all of them are interrelated, and they took place like chronologically in parallel ways. So one of the one of the difficulties of this book was being able to sort of combine all these issues together. So related to women, it tries to answer some questions. What implications did eating tortillas have for women? What role did women play in incorporating new technologies? How did they adapt to the new technologies? And how did their lives change once these technologies were adopted? Then, related to technologies, like why did technological change take so long? What factors drove it forward, and what held it back? How did new technologies spread? And then there's also the issue about companies, because finally it's companies that make all these new machines. They produce them and they sell them. So how did the companies that incorporated the innovations develop? Why did oligopolies form in both the nixtamal mills and the nixtamalized corn flour industry? And finally, about government policies. How did public policies surrounding the corn tortilla chain evolve? How did they promote industry concentration? And how and why did they lead to the industrialization and homogenization of tortillas? So first, I'm going to talk about women. First of all, there was a strict division of labor since pre-Hispanic times, in which men carried out the agricultural part of the problem, and women were in charge of turning corn into tortillas. Also atole, tamales, and other products made with nixtamalized dough. The issue is that corn is one of the easiest cereals to be cultivated, but the hardest to transform into food. So it was not very, like a very equitable division of labor. And well, the process for turning corn into tortillas requires shelling the corn, then preparing the nixtamal, which means soaking it with limestone, boiling it, and then leaving it there, like resting for like a whole night, so it turns soft. Then grinding the dough in the metate, and then forming and cooking the tortillas. And since pre-Hispanic times, a duality of maize and women became indispensable for sustaining life. So actually, for example, maybe you've heard of the famous Malinche, the woman of Hernán Cortés. Well, she was given to him as a present, together with several bags of corn, because the cacique of Tabasco thought, why? Well, he offered Hernán Cortés some corn and then thought, no, without women, this will be useless. So I have to give them some women as well. And between the 20 women he gave them, one of them was Malinche. Also, in another document I found from 1807, a commander that was in charge of militias in Tampico, in the northwest of Mexico, he sent a letter to the viceroy asking him for women because his troop was starving, and the women that had been making tortillas were very sick and they were not willing to be doing that job anymore. And it was like many letters going and coming, telling about the different difficulties of finding women who would take this chore. And the viceroy asked, but why can't soldiers make their own tortillas? But they couldn't. It really became like a taboo, even until present Mexico. Now it's a bit declining, but it was like men could not make tortillas. And this issue of this duality is present all through Mexico's history. And you can find it, and that's why I say let us see how women were present in every important construction, every cathedral, every pyramid. For example, in the drainage of Mexico City, all this large channel that was built, when you look at the figures, you realize there were thousands of women working there, making tortillas for the workers that were making the channel. Also in all the mines, all the plantations, you had to have hundreds of women working there to make tortillas for the men who were doing whatever. And we find them in the revolution. Actually, the soldaderas, whose role was kind of like, what were they doing there? Where they were making tortillas. And this is also present in every war, from the war with the United States to the French invasion. You see that this was even like a logistic military problem for Mexican army, because the soldiers had to come with a regiment of women who would make tortillas for them. And back in 1902, I found this in a newspaper talking about the slavery of metate. This is a stone in which tortillas are made. And it says that it has been a kind of slavery for Mexican women who had spent her strength, her health, and her time in the miserable task of grinding the nixtamal day by day, so that her whole family, whether large or small, eats breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but always consumes tortillas by the dozens every time. And this really became an issue to be solved, like a policy problem. in the early 20th century. Actually, when women began to be required for working in the factories and in other places, like before that, it wasn't even thought of as a problem since there was not, well, it was not, there wasn't not really many alternative jobs that were thought for women, particularly indigenous women. And well, once I will talk about how technology developed, but once the technology, the new machines began to be invented, women had a very important role in adopting them. And we can see there was cultural and patriarchal resistance towards them. And through the work of several anthropologists who visited and did ethnological research in towns like Tepoztlán, we see that at first men really opposed that women used, for example, nixtamal mills. And so the first mills were actually closed, and women really, like the people talk, for example, to Louis, an anthropologist, they explained to him that a women's revolution had to be carried out, so women were allowed to go to the mill, and and after that, women began. Well, they earned a lot of time that they used to grow vegetables, to produce art crafts, to undertake commerce. And all these traits were not really registered in the census, so we don't see right away an increase in labor participation of women. But in these anthropological accounts, we can see that it's taking place, and also that girls are able to study for longer years at school, because before that they were taken away from school to make tortillas. Even demographical patterns, for example, we see that there are more nuclear families instead of patrilocal families or extended families. Earlier, women went to live to their husband's household because the chore of grinding corn was so intensive that old women could not carry it out. So they required young women in the house. So at first, daughters carried out that job. But when they married, they went to their husband's household. But the wives of sons came to live at the household, and the daughters-in-law became the ones who grounded the corn. And we see like a change after in the 1930s, by which more nuclear families began to be established. Okay, and there are also many instances in the documents of women fighting organizing to get mills established in their towns. From the 1930s to the 1980s. As you see, and I like this picture because of that, you see that women are sleeping in maybe it's like 4 a.m., like making a line in the mill to be able to grind their corn. And this tells us first of how difficult it was to do it in the metate, because if you are willing to make a line for hours to grind it in the mill, well, it tells you that was better. And also something that I'm also going to talk about, that the fact that mills became monopolies in different towns made it very hard for women to be able to grind their their corn, because not only they were charged more money for that, but also they had to make longer lines and they were not treated very fairly or well to be provided that service. In towns and still nowadays, women made the nixtamal at home and then took it to be ground in the mill and then took it back at home to make their tortillas. So this is the kind of what we are what is happening in this picture, and that's why many women were organizing to establish their own mills. So they had some mills more close to their houses and not having to make long lines. Also, some other anthropologists talk about how going to the mill became like the center of social life and another space. And then we realized how isolated were women, like earlier, like even in the beginning of the 20th century in many rural areas, with lives like very confined in the house. And this really allowed them to go out and make some community with other women. And even today, there's a saying, like when you have not like the most recent news, you would say like, no, I haven't still gone to the mill. So it's like a way of saying like, that's where you get the news. Early, when these technologies came about, the labor in many of the nixtamal mills and then in tortillerias gradually became more masculinized. So there were also many struggles by women in unions, for example, in Guadalajara. They were especially relevant, fighting to be able to work in these new businesses, and this is also something that this book deals with. And well, finally, the liberation from the metate. What did it produce? Well, first it reduced the working hours of domestic chores, like very strongly. And I found some data on how it took place in the US, like from 1900 to the 1970s. And you see in the US, it came like from 58 hours per week of domestic work to 18 hours per week. And that's due to not only stoves and washing machines and all that, but also electricity and running water, sewage. In Mexico, it went from between 82 to 141 hours a week. And this is very accurate because it was the notes taking by ethnologists that were accounting all the hours that were spent by women doing work, domestic work, to around 43 hours per week in the late 90s. So you see, it's still a lot more in Mexico, but the reduction was huge. And in studies, econometric studies done in the US that study how this reduction in domestic chores have had an impact in labor participation by women, it says that it accounts for more than half of the increase in women's labor force participation between 1900 and 1975. So this must also have an impact in Mexico. At first, from 1930 to 1970, part of the new time that women had was used for having more children. And this nowadays that we are like very conscious of demographic explosion and might sound like it's not such a good idea. But back in 1930, when Mexico had around 15 million inhabitants, it was really a constraint for economic growth. And so it was an important contribution for the development of the country, this increase in population. It was more than it would have been optimal, but and then from the and also in all these other occupations that were not registered in the census, as women, for example, just having some vegetables grown in their houses and then selling them, and things that were not registered like in the formal economy. But then from the 1970s on, we see this increase in female participation in the labor force. And this also is related to higher education of women that began since the 1930s, since women were able to go for longer years to school. So I show some figures of how fertility decreases, especially in the cohort born in the 1940s, that is the one that had children in the 1970s. Also how the literacy gap decreases, and that this takes place earlier on, around 1930. And the increase in labor participation that is related to both. And well, these are figures of how a large part of the female population until the 1990 is really doing house chores of one way or another, either as housewives or as servants in houses, but gradually the share of women who are not doing house chores is increasing particularly between 1940 and 1960, that increases. So now I am going to talk about the technological change. And well, first of all, the domestication of maize, which is not a plant that grows naturally, but was developed through a long period of time, as well as the process of nixtamalization, were really like the most important inventions of Mesoamerican civilizations, and actually the reason Mesoamerican civilizations existed. Without them, it would not have been possible. But then there's a huge lapse between these inventions and the first nixtamal mills. Nixtamalization enhances hugely the nutritional value of corn. It's completely different to eat corn just grounded dry than the one that is grounded after nixtamalization, because there's a chemical reaction between the lime and the corn that enhances both proteins and calcium and makes it more digestible, also makes it easier to be stored. Without nixtamalization, if a diet is based mostly in corn, you get diseases like pellagra that happened in Europe because they imported corn, but not the nixtamalization. So this is very important, and this is why, I mean, it's not just like a whim to eat tortillas instead of, it's something that really made corn being able to be the staple of the country, and also the geography and ecology of Mexico makes it difficult to grow other cereals as wheat. Like they are grown in the northern part, and then we have wheat tortillas, but not all over the country. So as you see in this picture, back in Egyptian times, women also grounded wheat in the same style as maize, was later grounded, but there were technological developments since ancient Greece, whereas in Mexico, it took until the late 19th century for this to develop. And we usually don't think of the industrialization of the main staple as something that happened years before the Industrial Revolution, but it was key for Western civilization to develop. So there are many reasons. Basically, why there's this huge technological delay, the slow growth of the population, of urbanization, of means of communication and transportation, the slow evolution of the patent system, the shortage of manufactured goods like iron and also iron and fossil coal, poor education, especially for like very concentrated in the elites and with very little emphasis in technical knowledge. But the most important is the relative price of capital and labor. Basically, the low wages that women were paid and the slow wage growth in general through like until the 1950s and high capital costs. No, so it also has to do with, it has mostly to do with that. But this technological change took place first with nixtamal mills between the 1890s and 1920s. The tortilla machines, that this was really, it also started in the late 19th century, but the main change took place in the 1950s, as well as nixtamal corn flour. So here, like I looked at patents figures to see like how the patents of these different technologies were developed, and you see, well, I don't want to spend a long time explaining this, but you see these trends. And it's also important that most inventors were Mexicans. Also, some of them were Mexicans living in the US. And well, as I said, with nixtamal mills, it starts in 1856 with Vicente de Ortigosa, who invented the first nixtamal mill and then also the first corn flour. And then further the development continues until the 1930s, when you get more or less the same kind of nixtamal mills that you have nowadays. And the diffusion of mills takes place mostly between 1930 and 1960. 1980. And then it goes down because corn flour starts replacing nixtamal mills. And with tortilla machines, there's also a long development, and there's like the key invention that takes place in the 1950s. Before, tortillas made by tortilla machines were very, very bad, so only few people wanted to have them, and some of them were Mexican Americans because they did not have a choice. So that's why Mexican Americans are also an important part of this story, because they were willing to use like the new technologies for having tortillas. And in Mexico, this is a development more like it developed from the 1950s on, together with urbanization. And with nixtamalized corn flour, also it was a long development, but the main turn around of the main invention took place in the 1950s via in a laboratory sponsored by the Bank of Mexico, in which they invited the Armour Research Foundation, a research foundation from Chicago, Illinois, and they built this industrial research center where they developed it. It was a complex issue to develop a flour tortilla, a flour for making tortillas that made tortillas that tasted okay. Before that, there were flour tortillas, but were also like not very good, and only like cotton plantation workers wanted to eat them. And also, like, the first corn flour company was built. It was a government company called MINSA. And then, well, the companies of all these. And it's also like a very permanent feature, the fact that every time a new technology appears, it very soon becomes a sector that is concentrated in just very few companies, which is something that really diverts part of the earnings of the new technology and takes them into the owners of these big companies. And this took place with nixtamal mills at first, because some of them were able to form larger companies and get lower electricity rates. So they formed like some conglomerates, regional conglomerates that monopolized the mills. And also they established like local monopolies, like the one in the picture, no, where you didn't have a choice to go from one to another. So these are some of the, for example, this is like from 1909 that people are complaining that there's a very damaging monopoly related to corn grinding. Also with corn flour, at first, there's an American who wants to make a corn flour company, and he makes an announcement to call for associates. And finally, Porfirio Diaz, the president, and some other members of his government formed a company with him that sold to the military and became a very successful company until the revolution came. And this was the first nixtamalina, the first corn flour, but was only like meant for the military because it did not taste very good. But then several companies developed producing this kind of not so good corn flour. Until the one I told you that was developed by the IMIT. And one of them was Maseca. And Maseca became very important. And it became very important because the owner of Maseca had very good friends in the government and got subsidized maize and got the patent or the technique for producing the new flour like without cost, and he gradually became, this company became gradually like the main seller of flour, like 80% of the market of flour in Mexico. And it was a good company that was able to expand internationally. So gradually the sales of corn flour in Mexico were relatively less important in comparison to the whole company, and its subsidiaries in the rest of the world became more important. So it basically has companies all over the world. As I said, there was this industrial concentration. Gradually, Maseca bought the other companies, and it also the government sold the private company. Well, first it didn't let it grow very much, and then it sold it. So at the end, these two companies take hold of most of the market, like 80% and 20% of the market. So finally, I'm going to talk a little bit, because time is running, of government policies towards corn and the corn tortilla chain. Basically, the idea since the beginning of the 20th century was to produce like a supply of the basic foodstuff that was at affordable prices and enough for the population, to limit inflation, to reduce conflicts, and to gain support from various organized groups. And in general, it was based in an idea of modernization. And these policies shaped not only the markets of like from corn to tortillas, but also the products themselves. From 1930 to 1980, you have increasing government involvement in all of these three markets. Then from 1990 to 2018, you have the regulation, privatization, also policies favoring flour over nixtamalized dough, more corn imports and large-scale production versus small-scale peasant farming. And from 2018, there's the intention to channel resources to farmers, but there have been few resources or fewer than required, and also poor management. And there's like a parallel, they were parallel and complementary policies, both in agriculture and in industry. In agriculture, it has been studied a lot, like the Green Revolution, for example. In industry, it was really parallel, this development of the corn flour and its promotion. But all of them led to what I call the homogenization of corn and tortillas. And that means that you will see that through different policies, this idea of having corn and tortillas at affordable prices actually meant reducing the scope of all the corn and tortillas possible to the one that was like the least minimum denominator or something, a common denominator, or like the cheapest quality. So it's like instead of having like several kinds of bread and one of them is cheaper and affordable, you just have one, which is the cheapest and affordable. So this is really an impoverishment both of biodiversity and of cultural, of the culture, because food and gastronomy are part of it, and it's necessary. So the channels of government intervention, one of them was price regulation, subsidies, foreign trade restrictions, permits to establish corn mills and tortilla factories, companies and government agents to do several parts of the trades required in the chain, and also the promotion of technological innovations. And one of them was price controls, was particularly had like an impact in this, in which I am telling you, of the homogenization of tortillas and corn, like in just like the cheapest kind, because it set guarantee prices for farmers to produce corn, and this is a price in which the government would buy the corn, but also it set like maximum prices for dough and tortilla makers. That was the highest price at which they could sell tortillas and dough. So everyone had incentives to producing just the cheapest kind. And it set just one price for masa, for tortillas, for corn, even though there are several kinds of masa, several kinds of tortillas. From the 1990s to 2018, as I said, there was the regulation, there was more imports, but also the price, the idea that there was like one tortilla and one masa, and it was part of the equation. As I said, import of corns increased. Of course, corn is a lot cheaper in the US than in Mexico. It's also different. Most of the corn grown in the US is yellow, whereas in Mexico it's white. And there were policies favoring corn flour also that had to do not only with thinking that making tortillas with corn flour is cheaper and more efficient, but also having to do with the fact that there were very close political and economic relationships between key politicians in this period and the owners of the Maseca company. So from between 1988 and 1994, corn flour sales increased by 111%, and its use to produce tortillas rose to 27%. But by 2017, about 46% of tortillas are made with corn flour, and Maseca produces around 71%, means a 24%. And if you look not only at taste, but also at nutritional value of tortillas, you see that there are differences among tortillas depending on how they are made and from which kind of corn they are made. And corn flour production really, although it began, as I said, in the 1950s, it became really important in the 1950s, in the 1990s. It's, as you see in this figure, it really increased in the 1990s. And well, this is a long story that continues till the present. Nowadays, well, very recently, the Commission of Competition has filed a suit against Gruma, like because telling it has like market power in the market. Although also recently the commission has been, there has been some legal reforms also in the Constitution that have reduced its autonomy, so it's really not so clear what is going to happen. And there's also some issues related to MGO policies because, as you know, GMO, genetic modified organisms. Well, corn has been every day more important, and in Mexico, because it's like where corn began to be developed, there are many varieties of corn, and there are many concerns that GMO corn contaminates other kinds of corn and reduces its diversity. So there have been several regulations related to that. And recently it has been in dispute, one of the disputes with the USMCA agreement. And actually in these disputes, basically Mexico or the US actually won in that panel, saying that Mexico had no scientific basis for claiming that this would damage corn in Mexico. But at the same time, there was an amendment in the Constitution making it prohibiting the use of GMO corn, MGO corn for food production. So it's still like an issue that it's pending, and we don't know where it's going to end. Still, native corn has kept on being grown in small plots, and diverse tortillas are still made like by indigenous women for sale in like small shops and family entrepreneurship. And well, there's this relation, like you need to have a demand for diverse corn, and this is in diverse tortillas, so they are related, and this is an issue still like having to be solved. Thank you very much.
Okay, John, over to you for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to first say hello and welcome to Aurora Gomez, with the regret that a sudden household case of COVID that I have so far escaped, but has kept me home and isolated. Thus, I greet you only on Zoom. I want to emphasize beyond, I think, words are capable of, the importance of Aurora's new book, El Pan Nuestro. It does two things together and simultaneously. It puts sustenance, literally the food that keeps humans alive, at the center of Mexican history, and really tells us it belongs at the center of all history. Second, it puts women and their work at the center of Mexican history, and reminds us that we will not begin to understand that history until we take women's efforts seriously. I will say, and Aurora and I have been conversing about this project for a bit, though I never saw anything like the whole thing until the book came out and bowled me over. But she had helping me approach a conclusion that I have finally made explicit in my very recently published The Bahia Revolution, that women constituted the primary, and I say this explicitly, the primary laboring class in Mexican history from time immemorial till the late 20th century. The laboring class, and think about the words, women experienced labor to generate the entirety of the Mexican population, and still do. Women did the endless labor, as Aurora has emphasized, 5 to 6 hours a day, 365 days of the year, to turn the corn that men, often their husbands, raised into the essential sustenance. I spent a lot of time studying men's labor in the field, and I can kind of figure out that men perhaps worked 5 to 7 hours a day for about 200 days scattered through the year to produce the corn. Nothing compared to the labors that women did daily, endlessly, to turn the corn into tortillas and then into the meals that sustained the families. If that's not enough, the majority of Mexican women, particularly of indigenous women over the long haul, also literally made the cloth and clothing that clothed their families. They weren't just producing sustenance, they were making the cloth and clothing. They regularly kept small gardens, raised, Hope's yard, small animals. And by the way, were the dominant figures in local and regional markets, selling what they made to others forever. If you put all that together and you ask whose labors sustained Mexico from time immemorial to the middle of the 20th century, I believe the only possible answer is women to that. And we need to start taking that seriously. And as Aurora shows up, the nature of maize and of making it into tortillas is uniquely complex and difficult, but also uniquely nourishing. It's been argued that only maize into tortillas and Asian rice are equally sustaining of nutrition of populations. Wheat is a waste of land in comparison in sustaining global populations. So we need to start taking that seriously. And once I concluded, convinced by Aurora, that women were the primary labor force in the long run of Mexican history, I then began to understand other aspects of this. I started asking myself, while women moving on a large scale into non-household labor really begins in the middle to late 19th century and obviously has continued in more complex ways. But I asked myself, how should we now understand differently those pivotal cases when women did go in to the labor force, when they remained socially the primary maize-making sustainers? And I asked myself, the first well-documented example of women moving out of households to take full-time jobs, laboring for pesos, for income, appears to be, we may learn more, but in the late 18th century, they were drawn in to work sorting ores in the silver refineries of Guanajuato and other regions of northern Mexico. And of course, the employers, the silver refiners, said, oh, their hands are so nimble. They do the work, and they're more attentive. They do the work better. But they also did it for half the cost of laboring men. And so clearly they were drawn in to lower costs to maximize profits in silver. And the question is, why would they do it? And I started to think, perhaps to escape the backbreaking labor 7 days a week, endlessly. And it starts to become an equation of greater complexity and greater understanding. And then I asked myself, because these women still needed to eat, who made the tortillas that fed the women who moved into silver refining in the late 18th century? And as far as I know, no one has asked or addressed that question. It's worth a thought. Not long after that, women became first important and then primary laborers in the large cigar rolling factories of what was Mexico's late 18th century tobacco monopoly. There were 4,000 to 5,000 women laboring in Mexico City's tobacco factory, 3,000 to 4,000 in Querétaro, thousands elsewhere. And from what we can tell, as life became strained in the late 18th century, many of them were widows or single mothers needing a means of support. There, it became clear to get them into the tobacco factories, thanks to some important studies. We know that the factories had to create basically a mutual aid process in which the women in the factory contributed to funds to take care of them in case of injury, illness, etc. And with that, they would come work in the factory, and the factory provided daycare for the children who had to be attended to because that was traditional women's labor. They were no longer able to do 12 hours a day in the tobacco factory. Again, nobody's asked. And on this one, I went to look in Susan Dean's great book. Nobody's asking who made the tortillas. How were the tortillas drawn in to make this possible? And then when textile mills began in the 1830s and 40s in Mexico, we start to see a subset of women drawn into working in the textile mills. And some of my work in the new book on the Bajío Revolution engages some of these women doing this at the great Hercules mill east of Querétaro in the 1840s and 50s. And they come closest to making it explicit that they had the chance to remain in maize-making families, family cultivators, and they opted explicitly to take the wages, which, yes, were low, and the work in the factory, but the wages and work were real, and step away from the challenges of maize making, though there is also a meaningful set of hints that I would say need investigation going forward, that many of these young women, because that mill is surrounded by some of the richest maize-making huertas, they're kind of like chinampas, that in fact it almost becomes an integrated project in which some members, men and women, stay with the huertas, do the work of cultivating maize and making tortillas, while others, particularly young women, stepped aside to work in the mill and generate income. And how that fit together, again, we need to know. And I just say all of this because I didn't begin to be able to ask these questions about the evolution of women's roles in the Mexican economy through the 18th and into the 19th century until I finally had access to Aurora's El Pan Nuestro. And then I just want to leave the group with what is to me the enormous question that complicates everything. And that is, Aurora documents beyond doubt that the rise of technologies to make, tortillas and nixtamal and finally, maize flour, corn flour, has liberated millions, and there are ever more millions of Mexican women who no longer have to do the back-breaking labor of making tortillas from raw corn every day. It is unquestionably a liberation. And as Aurora shows, that has come with openings to women into other aspects of rural life, into education. It has also led in time, as maize production, thanks to the Green Revolution, was industrialized. It has pressed an enormous transfer of rural to urban population while the population grew. The question that remains is, it seems to me, there is in other words, what portion of the liberated women have been able to successfully find lives ranging from fair work generating income to professional lives and more in an economy that is ever more dedicated to what are euphemistically called labor saving ways. I've been known to call them labor eliminating ways of production. And it seems to me it is a contradiction and a dilemma that Mexico and Mexicans face to this day. And Aurora makes it clear we have to continue exploring it. So I want to again say thank you to Aurora for generating a book of transforming importance. And I want to hope that everyone else in the room has time to engage you in further questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So before we go into questions, I wanted to make the first question. No? So does the book look into the transition that John was talking about between, I mean, the appearance and deployment of mills and the entrance of women or full entrance of women in the labor force? What happened to the price of tortillas? What happened to the wage of women, the real wage? Did we have a transition in which we have a problem with women, a lot of labor supply coming into the market and wages coming down until the women were absorbed in different jobs? Or exactly how this process of women's participation in the labor force took place? That is one, and together is these monopolies that were formed in the tortilla business significantly constrained the social benefits of the technological revolution, and that translated into much higher profits for the monopolies, but relatively small benefits from the population, or how this whole transition played out, no? I mean, every time we see a new technology, there is this question: to what extent the benefits of the new technology are going to be distributed significantly among the population, are going to be concentrated on the owners of the technology, no? Okay. Oh, so you say.
Is it okay here? Yeah. Regarding the first question, what I found is that at first, like since the late 19th century until, let's say, like 1950, basically women were not entering like hugely the labor force. The time they were not using in grinding corn, they were using it in doing chores that were more like in the informal market, like growing animals, vegetables, is in commerce like that, but also having more children. You see like a huge population growth that begins like after the Mexican Revolution. So as I said, it is not really until the 1970s that you see an importance in an important growth in labor participation, like in the formal market. So there's a delay that has to do with the increasing population, but also more women are being educated. So when women get into the labor force, they are more educated because of that time that they were able to spend going to school. In terms of wages, it is really this incorporation of women into the labor force that took place in the late 19th century and early 20th century was important for mills to begin to be established in urban places, because there needed to be some, like wages needed to be at some level for mills to be like profitable, and for families to want to spend some money grinding the mill, the corn in the mill. And this only took place then. And you can see in the different towns how there's really a trade-off, and some women are too poor to be able to go to the mill to grind their corn. So and about 73% of the labor employed in making tortillas is just grinding the corn. So tortillerias, or making the tortillas actually to eat, is something that only takes place in the 1950s. And the inventors of those machines were really like, they suffered a lot because they were not, people were not buying their machines, and they were not buying the tortillas from their machines because women labor continued to be really low. So it's only in the US, and there could be some quantitative analysis like done looking at those comparisons, because it is in US cities where Mexicans live, like Chicago, like Los Angeles, in Texas also, where the first tortillas machines are established and are able to be like profitable businesses. And in Mexico, it's only in the 1950s. And you can see in the figures that it corresponds also to higher wages, both for men and women in that period. And it comes together with industrialization. So there's like a clear correspondence, and it's like there's not so much information to be able to tell it like more precisely in terms of in quantitative terms, but it's something that is clearly related.
Okay.
The second question.
That's basically it. I mean, so maybe, I mean, let's open up the floor for questions.
And I remember the second. Yes, it's also something that I would have hoped to be able to quantify more clearly, but it's the fact that the monopolies are formed both first with nixtamal mills and then with corn flour reduces an important share of the benefits that these new technologies would have provided to the population. But part of this benefit is taken away, not in monetary terms, but in terms of time spent in lines waiting for the mill to open and things like that. Also the taste and quality of the food.
Yeah. Thanks. So if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and we'll give you the mic.
Could you speak a little bit more about how the development of like actual like palatable nixtamalized corn flour influenced women's labor, as opposed to, I know you mentioned the kind of bad tasting ones that were just used for the military, but I know that I don't know, is modern masa harina like part of this? Like, how is that incorporated into women's labor today, and what was that transition like?
Okay, that is a more modern development, or more contemporary development, because as I said, even though it was developed in the 1950s, it's more like a 1990s development. And I actually believe like the most important change in terms of women labor took place with the mills, with the establishment of mills. Because I said that took most of the labor for making tortillas. But the fact that flour exists, or that tortillas can be made with flour, makes them cheaper and makes them also, it became easier to produce them, like to make packaged tortillas, or to make also tortillas in the supermarket are made from flour, and flour is easier to store and to carry to different parts of the country. So that, I think that's something that would require more research, like what's really like the benefit in terms of price and of time saving of flour tortilla relative to masa tortilla. But part of it has to do with usually tortillas made with masa are bought daily at the tortilleria. So it takes some time to do that, to just get in the line and get warm tortillas from the tortilleria instead of buying, for example, packaged tortillas in the supermarket. But also there's like a trade-off in the quality of the product that is relevant. So I guess it has more to do with the price of tortillas, but also it's something that I argue is that policies have unnecessarily reduced the different kinds of tortillas possible to like very few and very limited types. And in terms just of the market, there could be space for many different kinds of tortillas. And also part of what I say is that some women who make tortillas for sale, and these are like more artisanal kinds of tortillas. They grind the corn in the mills, but they make them like by hand. Are also an important source of employment for several women, for example, from different towns in Oaxaca that they then go to sell to larger cities. And so there's also, in terms of employment and possible sources of income, there are some policies have not been so good at adapting or allowing these kind of businesses to be successful. Now more, but at some point when it was really forbidden to sell tortillas at a price above the ceiling price that was established, it was really something almost illegal to sell tortillas above that price. So it was impossible to sell, or it was only in the informal economy that you could sell tortillas of higher quality.
Thank you. Have you looked at other countries beyond Mexico, and if it was the same social norm that women were the only ones that could do tortillas existed in other countries throughout the region? And has that impacted the incorporation of women into the labor force differently in different countries?
Okay, because tortilla eaters are just like a few countries, like Guatemala, for example. I've looked at some Central American countries, and it's interesting because in places like Guatemala, it's even more like there have been done more anthropological and ethnological studies, and the indigenous the indigenous percentage of the population is larger. So it's interesting, for example, in terms of how Gruma, the Maseca, the ground corn flour company, has been able to enter in those countries. In Guatemala, for example, it has had not a lot of demand because there's like a lot of people give a lot of importance to the taste of tortillas, and whereas in Costa Rica, it was flour tortillas have completely displaced masa or nixtamal tortillas. But yeah, I think that there's like a lot more that can be studied in those parts.
I know you also mentioned that this problem affects Indigenous women. It affects all women, but it specifically also affects Indigenous women. And I think that that's reflected in the discrimination in like modern day like wage gaps and wealth gaps that exist between Mestizo women and Indigenous women. So I was wondering how the tortillas either reflect or influence this modern day discrimination and disparity between Mestizo women and Indigenous women.
I believe many of the issues I deal with when talking about the influence of tortillas and how it influenced the history of women, it's more important for Indigenous women. So it would be interesting to try to understand how the gender gaps, for example, in the Indigenous population are different from gender gaps in the whole population, and how and perhaps they are related with tortilla making, for example. And this could be perhaps studied better in places like Guatemala, because in Mexico it's not so large, the percentage of Indigenous population, and in the censuses it's harder to grasp. But I think it must have an impact on that, but also on discriminating the work of making tortillas. And I think it's both ways. It's not only when I was wondering, like, why haven't this issue of tortillas been studied more? I realized that there's like people ask me, like, but why are you making a history of tortillas? Like, it's something in some ways like despicable, and if that is related with discrimination towards Indigenous women.
Another question? Or while we wait for another question, Aurora, anything you want to say regarding John's comments? That I think we...
No, I'm so grateful to your comments, John, and also to your support through the writing of this book. And no, I really appreciate them, and hope that, as you say, like, it opens more venues of research and questions, because it really opens a lot of questions, like some of the ones you are making that we have no answers to them.
Can I leap in with a little anecdote, if I may?
Of course.
Several years ago, this will tell you so much about Aurora Gomez. I had given a talk, I think, introducing the Mexican heartland at the Colegio de México. And Aurora volunteered to drive me and my wife, Jane, from the Colegio to the Hotel Maria Cristina, where we were staying in the center of town. And I have never been on a more energized, active transit of the entire southern half of the enormity of Mexico City. Back streets, main streets, side streets, zigzagging everywhere, never missing a beat while she was explaining what she was turning to in this new project on women and tortillas in Mexico City. And so what I want to say is Aurora navigated the most difficult aspects of our modern urban high-tech world while beginning to explain to me why taking on the question of women and tortillas was so important. And that experience sort of stayed with me until finally, and I don't know if anybody's held it up, so I will hold up the book. It's a must read. Read the book.
Thank you. We have another question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Professor Gomez, I really appreciated the ways you paid attention to kind of the physical effort involved in tortilla making and grinding maize and then sitting in line for the mill, right? Each of these moments where you highlighted, right, what that might be for the women who are doing this work, whether, you know, it transforms over time. I guess, could you speak a bit to, as a historian, how you think about like kind of the role of the body, of women's bodies as they're doing this labor and what that effect is like, what sort of things you're imagining and thinking about as you're analyzing that? And then if you were to carry that forward into like the later 20th century, similar sorts of questions about how these transformations in the technology and the economy of tortilla making, how is that, like, how would you continue that reflection on the physical aspects of change in women's labor as it relates to tortilla making in more recent history, or with these later economic transformations you talk about? If that makes sense.
Well, I think in general, I thought that the labor that women made was physically less intensive. For example, making clothes or cooking, and then I realized that making tortillas was really something that required lots of muscle power. And actually, for example, in the ethnological accounts of Tepoztlan, they say that women suffered like some disease in the knees that had like a special name in Nahuatl, and it was prevalent. So you realize how like it really made like it was physically very I mean, even like to provoke some problems, no, in the body. And then an archaeologist has recently showed me some papers about skeletons from ancient times, pre-Hispanic times, showing also these problems in the knees that they have found in female skeletons of ancient times. So I think that really tells of some work that is physically very difficult, like mining or like some other work that we usually attribute to men. And it's also telling of the fact that women nobody could make this kind of work when they were old. So that's why they had to make these family arrangements. So there were always young women doing this job. So I think that in some ways also changed my way of thinking of female, like as a feeble sex, or as they were understood like in 19th century writings. And well, how has this I think the way we understand female labor is many times in a way passed through this idea of being less strenuous or less, requiring less effort. And I think we have to change that in the way we think about it. And there's also in Mexico, there's even some terms for that, but there are some words in Mexico that mean being lazy that are related to male. And like to male, and then I understood, yeah, like through history, in the way things have been going on, and when you realize all this work that was done, in some ways, women were always working a lot more.
Maybe to close, I mean, in the second part of the presentation, you spoke about the concentration of the industry and how, I mean, part of that came about given the political connections and the political networks, etc. Is there any, I mean, in the work that you did, were you able to see what was the motive behind that? What was a policy motive, thinking that economies of scale were there and this was going to benefit the population, even with a monopoly or oligopoly structure? Was it just, let's call it, the search for profit by politicians, and it's much easier just to form a monopoly and get kickbacks from them than to generate a structure that will collect rents from a lot of medium-sized firms? Was it a logic of political control of the corporate sector disregarding the welfare of the population? And so was there any idea, or it just came about kind of organically between the interaction of some politicians and some business people?
That's a very good question. In the case of Maseca, which is more like it's closer and it's easier to study. I think there was clearly an idea that it was more efficient to use corn flour than masa. Yeah. Also, mills and the way mills were organized were not like perfect competition. There were many mafias surrounding mills and many political interests surrounding mills. So it was, in a way, not only an economic modernization, but also a political modernization. And perhaps the interest groups surrounding those mills were more related to an older kind of PRI groups. And then taking hold of Maseca by the Salinas and Han Gonzalez, for example, was in a way a means to replacing those other groups. So there's something a lot more complex in terms of politics than what I have been able to see. And there was also economic interest, because for sure, there's a lot of evidence that part of that rent that they got from the monopoly went not only to the business part, but also to the political part.
Well, thank you very much, Aurora. As John said, I mean, it is a must read. It's a great book, and you can read it from many angles. It touches upon so many dimensions of Mexican economic development and society that it's a humongous work. I mean, Aurora didn't even get into the sources, the time that it took her to undertake this work. So please join me in a round of applause, and we'll have something to drink. And if you want to continue talking to Aurora, you can do it.
Thank you, John. And I am so sad that we couldn't get together, but there has to be an occasion soon that you come to present your book to Mexico.
I'm hoping. Life is.